In this lecture, I wish to introduce Philip II of Macedon. I referred to him in the last lecture as coming to the throne after a colossal defeat suffered by his brother and king Perdiccas III. Philip, within a year of coming to the throne, began to evolve a new Macedonian way of war. And one of Philip's great contributions was to create the army with which Alexander conquered the Persian Empire. We have very limited information about how Philip did this. The literary sources all agree that he was the first Macedonian king to rearm the Macedonian infantry with a sarissa, which is the Macedonian version of a pike, which may have been between 18 and 21 feet long. Some scholars think it was a bit shorter. But this weapon was at least twice, maybe 2.5 times the length of the usual spear carried by Greek infantry, Greek heavy infantry known as hoplites. In rearming the Macedonian army, Philip had to do two things. First, he had to devise new systems of tactics, and in many ways the weapons and the armaments of this new model army of Philip reflected a change in tactics, a decisive change in tactics that changed the face of warfare really until the arrival of the Roman legions in the eastern Mediterranean, when essentially the legion replaced the Macedonian phalanx. The second aspect about this is to create this army, Philip literally had to pull off a social economic revolution in Macedon because it required the rearming and disciplining of the infantry, as well as a reorganization and a complete refocusing of the ethos of the cavalry forces provided by the nobility of Macedon. And so what I wish to do in this lecture is to deal initially with those reforms and describe briefly what we think the army of Philip II looked like by the time he died in 336 BC and Alexander took over this army. And Alexander made a number of important changes of his own, but that will come later. And then I want to look at 3 decisive battles in the 4th century. These are the battles of Cunuxa in 401 BC, fought between the Persian pretender Cyrus the Younger and his older brother, King Artaxerxes of Persia. And that battle shows a classic Greek hoplite phalanx in operation. It is essentially the type of battle the Spartans would wage. The Greek mercenaries in Cyrus's pay were overwhelmingly Peloponnesians. There were some Thessalians. And the senior commander, Clearchus, was a Spartan who had long experience in the Peloponnesian War. The second battle, we'll look at the Battle of Leuctra. I've mentioned this battle as well. That is a battle in which the Thebans, heading up their federal forces of Boeotia, decisively defeated the Spartans. And it's the first time a Spartan army was defeated in a clear win, a great hoplite battle. They had not been destroyed in detail. It hadn't been a question of ambush or attacks made from the rear. This is another decisive battle in the 4th century BC that marks a change. And the reason I selected this battle is because to some extent it's often regarded that Philip got his ideas from the Battle of Leuctra, which I do not believe was the case. And then I'll conclude with the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, where Philip and the Macedonian army showed itself to the Greek world. And that battle, which is usually dated to August 2nd, 338 BC or thereabouts, fought in late summer, not only ended Greek liberties, it essentially made Philip master of Greece, but it forever changed the face of warfare in the Greek world. So let's briefly look at Philip's reforms and what he had done. I said that to carry this out, he essentially had to effect a social economic revolution in the kingdom of Macedon because he needed to create a body of infantry and a cavalry force comprised of nobility who were devoted to the Argead royal house and would serve at a professional level and not as the sort of ragtag army that characterized earlier Macedonian forces. In this regard, he was remembered fondly throughout the reign of Alexander the Great, and I think one of the best indications of what happened actually comes not from sources in Philip's reign, but from a speech that Arrian attributes to Alexander in 324 BC at Opis near Babylon, at pretty close to the end of Alex's career, where the Macedonian soldiers have mutinied. And Alexander goes among those forces. He mounts a great tribunal, and he calls these men back to a sense of duty, discipline, and devotion to himself and to the Argead family by appealing to his father Philip. And we'll be talking about some of these issues later on. And it begins this way. First, then, I shall begin my speech with my father Philip, as is right and proper. For Philip found you vagabonds and helpless, most of you clothed with sheepskins, pasturing a few sheep on the mountainsides, and fighting for these, with ill success, against Illyrians, Trebalians, and Thracians on your borders. Philip gave you cloaks to wear. In place of sheepskins, brought you down from the hills to the plains, made you doughty opponents of your neighboring enemies, so that you trusted now not so much to the natural strength of your villages as to your own courage. Nay, he made you dwellers of cities and civilized you with good laws and customs. The word being nomoi, that is the law of citizens. It's almost the quality of a Greek city-state is what Philip did. That is, to create this army, he had to build cities, put in roads, create colonies on the frontiers. The Macedonians would be recruited into infantry regiments, regionally, put under royal officers, and the army would become a way of refocusing the loyalties of the Macedonians away from their distinct region to the royal officer and ultimately to Philip himself. And these ties were absolutely powerful and carried that army through the conquest of Greece under Philip and then the conquest of the Persian Empire under Alexander. And Alexander elaborates in this speech, talking about all the victories they achieved, first under Philip and then himself, and he concludes with the following. And so what is left for myself from all of these toils, save the purple and this diadem? These are the emblems of royal Persian authority that he has assumed over the last several years, and the toils refers to the conquest of the Persian Empire. I have taken nothing to myself, nor can anyone show treasures of mine, save these possessions of yours, or what is being safeguarded for you. For there is nothing as concerns myself for which I should reserve them, since I eat the same food that you eat, and have such sleep as you have, and yet I hardly think that I can eat the same food as some of you who live delicately. I know, moreover, that I wake before you, that you may sleep quietly in your beds. And this is within the tradition of Macedonian royal authority of leading by command, commanding by example. And Alexander was very much the same way as Philip. He served and shared the toils with his soldiers. Now, the army, as reorganized by Philip, broke down into three important components. First was the cavalry arm, and this was rearming the Macedonian cavalry with heavy armor, helmets, body armor, breastplate, backplate, greaves to protect the lower quarters of the legs, and giving the army a thrusting spear, a long thrusting spear, and teaching it to fight in tight formations. Essentially, the Macedonian heavy cavalry were turned into lancers. They were taught to fight in squadrons. In illae, or the plural illi, were the various squadrons of some 200 men or so, and squadron is an approximate translation, and it fits it pretty well. It's essentially comparable to the 18th century squadron in European armies. The army of cavalry, the force of cavalry, were known as the companions, the hetairoi, a term that had originally been extended to the close friends of the king and now extended to the entire cavalry arm. We think that the Macedonian cavalry, by the death of Philip in 336 BC, may have numbered some 4,000 men. There was also a cavalry force from Thessaly, that is in northern Greece, which is later added to the Macedonian army, and that force is usually comparable in size to the Macedonian, and it too fought as heavy cavalry in squadrons, or perhaps hipparchies, a different term that was used to designate these units. This cavalry was the striking force. It was the hammer in an anvil-hammer attack. Its function was to flank and take the enemy army in the rear. Sometimes this would be a single envelopment on the right wing. If possible, the idea was to envelop the enemy forces on both the right and the left. And in doing so, the nobility of Macedon were transformed from local barons and lords into professional soldiers who served at the capital, who served in the cavalry, were promoted, married into the royal household, and their sons were trained with the crown prince Alexander, and they were turned into an aristocracy of service devoted to the Argead house and also thoroughly professional on the battlefield. Then there were the two infantry components. And here Philip made a very important innovation. It's already clear he's doing this as early as 358 BC in a vaguely described battle against the Illyrians, the northern peoples who had given the Macedonians so much trouble. And the infantry itself was organized into two components. One was the phalanx. These men were organized into, the Greek term is a taxis or taxes. And this is a force of some 1,536 men, and at least paper strength. And that is because they stood 16 deep, and these taxes, which often are translated either as regiment or battalion, were named after their commanders, the royal officer, even though they were recruited regionally. And they stood shoulder to shoulder with this 18 to 20-foot sarissa. They did not carry the heavy body armor of Greek infantry. They were largely equipped with metal helmets, leather jackets, a small shield that they slung over their shoulder, and they stood in close formation. The first 6 ranks, their spears pointed out, and then the back 10 ranks held their spears at a diagonal, which actually acted as a way of knocking away arrows and slings and javelins that might be hurled at the infantry formation. This force would pin the enemy front while the cavalry would encircle, and you would have what is called a battle of encirclement, a classic battle of annihilation. The objective of the Macedonian army was to destroy the enemy on the battlefield, not to break it and pursue it, which was the technique in Greek warfare. There was a third component, which we believe goes back to Philip, known as the hypasopists. The hypasopists apparently are phalangites, that is, men of the phalanx, similarly armed but tougher and braver men. They probably carried the sarissa. They're originally 1,500 strong, later 3,000 strong, and they stood between the phalanx and the cavalry on the right flank, and they acted as the link between the heavy infantry and the cavalry force. So essentially you had this marvelous infantry force which could pin the enemy front, some 6 or 7 battalions of phalanx, the hypasopists, and then the cavalry concentrated on the right would sweep around. There were other forces that were recruited along the way: Thessalian cavalry, lots of light armed troops, including javelin men, archers, slingers, many Greek mercenary and later Greek allied forces. But the core of the army was Macedonian. And that army had been forged to fight a distinct way of war, which, while it owed something to the Greek tradition, was distinct and apparently original. Philip had come up with it on his own. That leads us to the second part of this lecture, and that is, how did this new model army, forged by Philip, represent such a decisive break in warfare in the Greek world? And that requires us, I think, to look at 3 key battles, which some historians would call battles that resulted in paradigm shifts. That is, the battle was so significant in the types of tactics that were used and the outcome that thereafter warfare would never be the same. And that requires us to look at these battles in a bit of detail. And I've chosen the 3 battles that function as that paradigm shift. The first one is the Battle of Canuxa, fought probably on September 3rd, 401 BC. And to refresh everyone's memory, since I've mentioned this battle twice before, this is the battle between a Persian pretender, Cyrus the younger son of the former king of Persia, against his brother Artaxerxes II. The battle was fought some 60 miles north of Babylon, and the army of Cyrus was essentially advancing with the Euphrates River on its right flank. The Greek mercenary infantry essentially occupied the right wing, and they included some 12,000 or 13,000 Greek mercenaries, of whom over 10,000 were heavily armed hoplites, men equipped in body armor with an 8-foot thrusting spear, organized according to their regional contingents, and apparently recognized as the senior commander a man named Clearchus, a Spartan officer. And essentially, this is a version of the classic hoplite battles long fought in the Greek world based along the Spartan model. And that meant the decisive attack would be delivered on the right wing. And the idea was to shatter the enemy line on the opposite side, and the enemy's side would be essentially the left wing. And that right wing would pursue and drive the enemy off the battlefield, and so win the battle. Cavalry played, in the Greek tradition, a rather subordinate role, whereas cavalry was all important in the Persian army. When this battle opened up, probably about 1 in the afternoon, Cyrus's army may have numbered some 35,000 against an opposing force that was perhaps 45,000, 50,000. The Greek mercenary infantry gave him his decisive edge. As the battle opened and the 2 lines neared each other, Cyrus wanted the Greek infantry to shift towards the center and support Cyrus, who was with his household cavalry. Well, the Greeks essentially ignored this. Clearchus pressed forward. The great king ordered his forces to engage, and on the great king's left, his cavalry actually got behind the Greeks, but ended up sacking the baggage train, whereas the chariots and infantry on the Persian left essentially broke and ran and were pursued by the Greek infantry for some 2.5 miles. So essentially the Greek army won the battle without actually coming to clash with the Persians and pursued them off the field. Meanwhile, the Persian army attacked their opponents on the other side, and Cyrus led his cavalry in the center in an attack against his brother, an ill-advised attack, and he was killed in the fighting. The Persian king Artaxerxes was apparently wounded, and again, the Persians pushed Cyrus's center and left off the field and sacked the camp. Well, about 3 o'clock or 3:30 in the afternoon, the Greeks returned. They broke off their pursuit. They had only suffered 1 casualty, and they found the Persian cavalry having a grand time sacking their camp. As soon as the Persians saw the Greeks, they reformed. The Greeks reformed, and essentially the Persians quit the field. They were not about to take on this infantry. This was a classic hoplite attack on the right wing, and it broke the enemy line. And the idea of encircling and destroying the enemy force really wasn't part of Greek warfare. Greek warfare essentially was break the enemy on the wing, drive it off the battlefield, and then the cavalry might pursue the stragglers. But essentially the idea was to control the field, set up a trophy, and force your opponent to return, to acknowledge your victory, and you would return his dead under treaty. Now this formation at the Battle of Cunuxa meant that Greek mercenary infantry were henceforth used by Persian kings and satraps. It was also the type of fighting that had characterized Greek warfare probably since the 6th century BC, and the Spartans were the best at it. And Cunuxa is essentially a Spartan victory, at least on the tactical level. What Cunuxa represented was the height of Spartan military discipline and training. And that gets us to the second battle in 371 BC, the Battle of Leuctra. Now, this battle was the first battle that engaged the Spartan army under King Cleombrotus I and the reorganized Theban army and the lesser cities of Boeotia, that is the so-called Boeotian Federal Army, commanded by Epaminondas. Also, the Theban army had a crack infantry unit known as the Sacred Band, 300 strong, which represented 150 male homosexual couples who were regarded as the best soldiers in the Boeotian army, the Theban army, and one would not abandon his lover on the battlefield, and the Sacred Band had been reorganized and drilled over the last 6 or 7 years by Pelopidas, the political leader of the Boeotian alliance, and Epaminondas. The variation at Leuctra was significant. Now, German authors writing in the 19th century argued that Leuctra was a showpiece that Philip of Macedon learned while he was a hostage at Thebes between 368 and 365 BC or somewhere in there. Philip was a hostage on good behavior for his kingdom. Philip was not at Leuctra. He was not at later Boeotian victories, and there's no direct evidence that Philip really took this stuff over from the Theban army. And if we look at the sources on the Battle of Leuctra is a Theban variation of the Spartan attack. The Thebans and Boeotians, and the Thebans refer to the principal city of the Boeotian League, which is the majority of the army, but there are 10 lesser states of Boeotia that also contribute forces to this federal army. The Theban army essentially was a version of the Spartan. They had been members of the Peloponnesian League. What Epaminondas decided to do, and the author Polyaenus, who writes about military anecdotes in the Roman age, said that Epaminondas concentrated his best forces not on the right wing, but on the left wing. And he attributes to Epaminondas the remark that, "I will destroy the serpent's head," and therefore destroy the Spartan army. In classic hoplite battles, the best heavy infantry was on the right, the exposed side of the infantrymen, and the right wing was always the decisive attack. In this particular battle, the Spartans had fielded over 1,000 Spartans, including 700 full citizens. The king was present, and the Spartan army lined up in classic formation with its main forces on the right. Opposed to it was the Theban army headed up by the sacred band and, according to sources, drawn back 50 deep. Not 8 deep, but 50 deep, with enormous weight. There was very little cavalry. The Spartan cavalry apparently attacked the Theban cavalry that was drawn up in front of the infantry and not on the flanks. The Thebans drove the Spartan cavalry off and into the Spartan right wing. King Cleombrotus had attempted to shift his army right to flank the Theban infantry, and it was botched. The Spartans did not have the same drill they had had at previous battles, and the Spartans moved too far to the right, opened up a gap between their right and center wing, and in barreled Pelopidas with the sacred band followed by the full Boeotian force. They flanked the Spartan center, crushed the Spartan army in general. Something like 400 Spartan citizens fell on the battlefield. The king was mortally wounded. The cavalry played a decisively limited role. It essentially pursued stragglers and had not really been a significant force in the battle. This was, in a sense, simply a Theban variation on a theme that was long practiced by the Spartans. Shift your best forces to your left wing, and if you can exploit a gap in the infantry line or flank it, you crush the enemy right rather than the enemy left. Again, the pursuit that followed was always one-sided. That is, the pursuing forces were cut down in great numbers. But this was not a battle of encirclement as understood by military theoreticians of the 19th century or by Philip himself. And that gets us to the third battle, the Battle of Chaeronea, fought in August of 338 BC. Now, Chaeronea, which comes essentially a generation after Leuctra, really does not show a Theban version of the hoplite battle. This battle was unusual in several ways, but it does point out the essentials of the Macedonian way of war. This battle climaxed a long struggle against Athens and Thebes, and it essentially decided that Philip would be master of Greece. And even the ancient authors tended to dwell upon the political outcome of this battle, rather than the actual details. Fortunately, we know where the battle is located. It is in Boeotia, in central Greece, at a small town of Chaeronea. That's actually the hometown of Plutarch. And the Greek and Theban and other allied Greek city-states were able to assume positions, very good defensive positions, on a slightly raised ground between two rivers, the Hymen on the left and the Kephisis on the right. The right wing was held by the Theban army and particularly the sacred band. And then the various allies were put in the center, and the Athenians held the left wing. There apparently was a little Greek cavalry at this. We hear very little about Greek cavalry forces. It may have numbered a couple of thousand. What we do hear about is light-armed infantry known as peltas, javelin men, who occupied the left wing of the Greek allied army, the rough ground, and so acted as an anchor supporting the hoplite, the heavy infantry, so they couldn't be easily flanked from the left. On the right, the sacred band stood right up against the river, the Kephisis River and its marshes, and so essentially the Greek idea was to force a defensive battle on a plain with the Greeks holding somewhat higher ground and just allow the Macedonians to charge against this position and break themselves. The Athenian commander was a fellow by the name of Chares, a well-experienced mercenary officer, and he had had a lot of success in fighting these kind of classic battles. But there were several problems with this coalition. First, the Athenians and Thebans had not fought together, nor had any of the others. And so what you had in the Greek ranks was a series of independent hoplite forces on the left, the center, and the right. The best by far were the Thebans. Against them stood a Macedonian army, and from all accounts, the armies were probably comparable in size. The Macedonian army was probably some 30,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry or so. The allied Greek army was approximately the same. It would have been weaker in the cavalry forces. The strength of the Macedonian army was in its discipline, its 20 years of experience, its new tactics and drill, and the command of Philip himself. Philip drew up his army as if he were to wage a battle of encirclement. And he placed most of his cavalry apparently on his left wing. that is along the Cephissus bank, so that it would attack essentially the Thebans, who held the strongest position in the Greek army. He also then had his infantry divided into two wings. A left wing commanded by Alexander, then 18 years of age and obviously the heir apparent, and Philip on the right wing. Philip concentrated his specialized light-armed forces on his right. They matched the light-armed Greek forces in the rough ground. Again, it was to prevent flanking. And then he ordered his army into motion. And the Macedonian army marched with perfect discipline and drill. And this is the first time Greek citizen armies, Thebes and Athens, two of the great states of Greece, the Spartans weren't present, now faced the Royal Macedonian army. This was the showdown of the 4th century BC. And that Greek army waited for the attack, and they must have been in awe as these huge infantry formations closed, deeper than usual Greek positions. That is, the Macedonians generally came in at 16 deep, not at 8 deep. Their spears projecting twice the length, held by two hands by the Macedonians. The back spears held at an angle so that any arrows shot into this formation were deflected. And as that Macedonian army moved with perfect discipline, Philip ordered it to halt briefly. And then on his right wing, his phalanx and his light infantry began to retire. They moved backwards, holding their ranks, but it looked as if they were backing off and retreating. And this was common in infantry combat. Very often the forces did not come to contact. One side would look at the opposing side and say, we really don't want to do this. They look tougher than we are. Now the Athenians, who saw this, concluded that Philip's forces were falling back in disarray, and the Athenian commanders eagerly ordered their forces forward towards the Macedonian army, which was falling back on the Hymen River. However, to do this, they shifted their forces left. And so the Greek army started to move not forward, but at a diagonal to the left. And the Athenians were going to pursue and get these Macedonians. In doing so, the whole Greek army shifted, including their center, which was held by Corinthians, Achaeans, Megarians, some of the lesser states, and part of the Boeotian army. The sacred band on the far right held its position. That was their task. That's what they would do. And so what happened is two problems emerged in the Greek army. A gap opened up between the sacred band and the bulk of the Greek army, and Alexander with the left-wing infantry charged into the gap, broke through at that point. The Macedonian cavalry poured through and carried out an encircling movement that destroyed the Greek army on the left side. The sacred band got isolated and was cut down to a man, and that point on the battlefield is still represented by a multiple burial, a monument where the sacred band was buried. They all fought, none of them fled, they were cut down to a man. On the Macedonian right wing, the Greek left wing, the Athenians began to move up the Hymen Valley and the rough ground, and what happened is the Macedonians, in perfect discipline, turned around, reformed, and launched an attack at the disorderly citizen hoplites and drove them back off the field, back down the Hymen, and then flanked the Greek army with its infantry, both its phalanx and its light infantry, on the Greek left side. So essentially what happened is Philip had lured the Greeks into an ill-advised maneuver that had put the Athenian army in disarray on the left flank, opened a gap on the Greek right flank, and through these two positions, the Macedonians moved in, got around the Greek army, and encircled and destroyed it. Now, this in part was necessitated because the battle was fought between two rivers and the cavalry could not deploy, and so the breakthrough had to be achieved by the infantry. But this is a classic Macedonian attack, hammer and anvil. That is, the heavy infantry in the center acts as the base from which the light infantry and the cavalry encircle and destroy the opposing force. And the results were overwhelming. Some 2,000 Athenians were captured, at least 3,000 Boeotians. The sacred band was wiped out. Demosthenes himself, the orator who had urged the alliance, threw his shield and fled the battle. After the Battle of Chaeronea, there was no question that it is the Macedonian phalanx and this new battle of annihilation that would dictate the course of military history. And it did so down until the 2nd century BC, when a new opponent arrived, the Romans. But this is the type of army Alexander took with him to Asia, and his refinement on these tactics would win Alexander the ancient world.